Okay, wonderful. So thank you, Jackie, for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Today is our last CHIWORK conversation for the year, and so we're very excited to be chatting with Dr. Jacki O'Neill, who's the director of MARI, and that's the Microsoft Africa Research Institute. We just had its launch, right? Was that last week? Or
that was the week before last. I think last week I was dead.
We're going to hear about that in just a couple of minutes, but congratulations on the launch of it, Jackie. So Jackie is passionate about designing technologies which enhance rather than remove agency and create sustainable futures. She brings this passion to the MARI, where she is building a multidisciplinary team, combining research, engineering, and design to solve local problems globally. She's an ethnographer by trade, and in her research career so far, she's focused on technologies for work with the aim of making work better, and technologies for social impact or societal impact with the aim of supporting underserved communities. So she's been looking at work way before this community came into being, the CHIWORK, and also the future of work became a thing. The inspiration for the MARI came out of this desire to create technologies to enhance work and society globally. Before leading the MARI, she was a principal researcher in the technology for emerging markets area at Microsoft Research India, which is where I know her from. And she's led major research projects in the future of work, from new labor platforms to workplace AI and chat, digital currencies and financial inclusion, and global healthcare. She has over 50 peer-reviewed articles, 2 innovation awards, and 16 patents. And she has served on the program and organizing committees of major conferences such as CHI, CSCW, ICTD, and ECSCW for many years. I have to say I really enjoyed this bio, Jackie, because it really kind of presents you as a person, as a researcher, who you are, rather than just, names of kind of areas and fields. So let's get started. I want to hear first about MARI and what you've been doing there, and then we'll move on to talking about future of work and CHIWORK stuff.
Okay, that sounds good. Everybody who's here, and the recording, you're going to have a small tour of my house, because my battery on my phone is now down to 20%, because it never rains, but it pours. So I'm just going to go and get my charger in the hope that I can still have this conversation. See, this is a more flattering angle. And hopefully we will not meet any of my naughty children on the way. Okay, so MARI is like a very new research institute. So this is the joys of pandemic work. You're getting the full-on pandemic work experience that I am setting up here in Nairobi. It's interesting because it has a number of things that are different about it in the Microsoft context, I suspect, which are, we are an applied research institute. So the idea is to conduct research that really impacts people's lives. So we're looking at that 1 to 5 year time span. And as probably everyone on this call knows, the thing that's really important, and I hope you can still hear me because the Wi-Fi is not brilliant. The thing that's really important when you're conducting research into work and research in an HCI, it's like you can have these wonderful advances in AI and in other technology. But, sorry, let me just sit down and then I'll plug this in. But they're not necessarily that useful if they don't fit into how people actually do their work. And so that applied research space becomes really, really important, especially as AI takes over, becomes more prominent. We really need to think, like, we have these amazing advances in AI. And I mean, it is really, there are some really amazing things happening year round. Language technologies are way better than I ever could have imagined, when I started my career, which is too long ago to even think about. So we've got these amazing advances in AI, amazing advances in technology, but they're all sort of useless if they can't actually apply them to people's actual life and work. And that's really what we're aiming to do, is really think about, well, how do we take these cool things that are coming out of research labs and apply them to real people's work on the ground, and very specifically on the ground here in Africa more widely, but Kenya specifically as well. You know, how do we take these innovations and use them in these situations where people are often mobile first, data and bandwidth is an issue. A lot of the really cool innovations are super high bandwidth, super high data, all of those things, and that doesn't work in the real world. And when we talk about designing for Africa, actually Africa just makes, when you're designing for Africa, it just makes obvious the constraints that are everywhere. Because if you go to the UK or you go to rural America, you will also find that bandwidth isn't plentiful, data isn't plentiful, you don't have brilliant 4G everywhere. And so actually many people across the world, everywhere in the global north and global south, can't use the things that big technology companies and researchers create because they just don't work. And I think anything that we design here is going to work, I would hope, everywhere in the world. So that's really the idea, be an applied research space, think about like how you can make these cool technology advances actually relevant to people, so they make people's lives better and not people's lives worse. I think that's the idea behind it. And then the only other thing that I should say, obviously, to do that, we're multidisciplinary teams, because you can't just have an HCI person, or you can't just have a tech, an AI person. You actually need HCI and AI, and you need software engineering, and you need design, and you need data science. And only by combining all these different knowledge, and ways of looking at the world, can you really design effective technologies that really help people rather than make their working life worse, which is the thing that I care about, I guess. And now while you ask your question, I'm just going to turn my video off, because I'm just going to dive under my table and try and plug my phone in. But I am listening to you, Neha. Well, in fact, you can just look at the ceiling.
Okay, good. All right. So there's so much that you said that I'm curious to ask questions about. Before I start, I just want to say that anyone else, if you want to put your questions in the chat, feel free to do that. I'll get to them at some point, and Andrew's helping me with the moderation of these. So Jacki, there's two questions that I have, and you can take them in any order that you want. The first one is, you worked in so many different regional contexts that I've really been wondering how this experience of yours in Kenya is different, is unique from what you had been doing in India before, and maybe also in comparison to some other contexts where you worked, but specifically India, because a lot of the things that you mentioned kind of sounded, like you might have seen some of those constraints in India as well. The second question I had is about the multidisciplinary teams. So how is that working out? How do you make multidisciplinary teams work, right? Because isn't that something that we're all sort of trying to achieve in our research, but it's really, really hard.
Yeah. Let me take the context one first, and then if I forget about the other one, just remind me. So in terms of the context, there are a lot of similarities, but there's also quite a lot of differences. And it's the type, in fact, the work that we're looking at is quite different here, but it's not that we couldn't have looked at work like this in India, but SMBs. So the majority of work across Africa is in small, very small and micro entrepreneurs, so single people businesses. That's one of the things that we're really focusing on here, and thinking about trying to understand like how to support those businesses. Whereas in India, there's lots of very, very small businesses and single person businesses, but there's also lots of very big businesses. There's some massive like homegrown as well as multinational Indian companies, Tata and, you know, all sorts of Infosys, and, you know, so there's both the very traditional companies and the small businesses, whereas here the vast majority of work is small businesses and informal, and the age of workers here is younger, or the age of the population here rather, not workers, is younger. So there's some really interesting things that brings when you're thinking about technologies for work. And actually one of the things that was the driver for opening the research center here was I was doing a study of Kaizala, which was Microsoft's chat app for work, and I was looking at large distributed organizations in India and Kenya, actually. And what was really interesting is the organizations that I was seeing in India were very hierarchical and very traditional in their way of distributing work, organizational communications, and so on. Whereas the organizations that I was looking at in Kenya were really innovative. So they were really looking at new ways of doing business, new ways of coming together. And that was one of the drivers, because if you look at how work is changing in America particularly, then you can see that there's a lot of, well, what was interesting about these organizations in Kenya is they were highly distributed, but they were often made up of other organizations, lots of small organizations collaborating together, if that makes sense, which is really challenging when you think of organizational communication, because where's the organizational boundaries? Sometimes the organizational boundaries includes everyone. Sometimes you want just the people in the HQ who actually run that very specific bit of the organization to talk to each other. And our technologies are not designed for flexible organizational forms like that. And so they've largely not been thought about in the design of technology. We have personal tech, and we tend to have like work tech that's typically designed for bigger organizations. So that was really interesting to think about. So that was one of the reasons for thinking about coming here, is to really understand how work's being done, the innovations that are taking place, and then what does that mean for technology? So that's the sort of context difference. And that's, yeah, you know, that's often, that can be as much a difference of perspective as it is. And so another thing I should say is, you know, I arrived here in the pandemic. It's still the pandemic. We're just back at the office now. So I certainly don't feel that I must, you know, I can say like, I really know Kenya, because I don't really know Kenya, you know. Not like I say I really know India either, but I knew certain parts of India pretty well because I've been doing my research there for some time. Like, so that's, when I say parts of India, I mean segments of work within India that I was studying. So that's, does that answer your question about the perspectives? Or about
Yeah. And also, you know, hearing this from an ethnographer, right, is also interesting, because you're seeing these things maybe from different perspectives. But I think it also links back to the other question I asked, which is, so in that context where you have these types of innovative practices, as you mentioned, how do you bring a team together to kind of work with this tech culture that's emerging?
Yeah, I mean, and the multidisciplinary team is tough. It's even tougher when you're doing it in a pandemic. And we only went back to the office in, I guess, February this year. So we were remote. We had a few meetings in my garden. There's a co-working space not too far from here that has outdoor offices, which basically is everything in an office. You have your floor, you have your desk and everything, and you have your ceiling, and there's just no walls. So when we needed to work together, we did that, but it's quite challenging, especially, anyway, it's challenging for a new team, but a multidisciplinary team, it's really challenging. My previous experience is that, and that was when I was with Xerox Research, this was how we did our research. I really believe that if you want to build tech for people to use to make their work better, you need these teams. And what we found was it takes about a year of working very closely on a collaborative project for you to start understanding each other. Because every discipline, we use the same words, but we're talking about different things. We each have our own disciplinary language, and it's really, and we look at things very differently. And that's actually the magic, because that's how you get new perspectives, how you get innovation, how you get really cool solutions, but it's also really challenging. And so we're still in that stage of really trying to work together and understand what each other means, but it's really worth the effort, because the things, once you understand each other, the way you can really use, like, you know, what does software engineering know about this? What does AI ML know about this? What do we as ethnographers or HCA people know about this? Like, that's where you get really, really, really cool innovation, but it's hard work. And in terms, for me, that was by design. So that was what I set out to do. So it was very much, I hired people, discussing that with them, you know, it's multidisciplinary, you're going to have these. So I was looking for people who are open to doing that, not people who are just like, I just want to work with other data scientists, or, you know, I think all your qualitative stuff is rubbish, which lots of AI people do think. And so, you know, it helps that you have to have people with the right mindset and the willingness to put in that work, because it can be really uncomfortable. It can be really uncomfortable at times. And you have to be willing to challenge each other's points of view, and also listen and learn and change your own point of view. Yes, they should.
So Jacki, I'm curious to know, this is something that we've actually talked about in the context of Kai as well, but do you think the world can be divided across like three groups: the qualitative people, the quantitative people, and the mixed methods types?
Oh, yeah, that's good. I would probably say quantitative and qualitative. I think mixed methods are just people who are interested in going both ways. And we do, you know, one of the things actually is I really learned the value of having that quantitative perspective, because if you're going to make these business decisions on the basis of research, you need to like have an idea, you know, and on the basis of qualitative research, you need to have an idea of like how much this thing is happening. So, you know, qualitative people will be, you know, we're all about what's happening, what's really happening, the depth of it. But then you need to, you know, you need both. And I think that if you can work together, then that gives, I mean, it just gives extra impact. It really does. Because, you know, the quantitative people can be really like, oh, this is what it looks like from the data perspective. And then the qualitative people can really help you understand why. And I think that adds a lot of value. Honestly, I think it's a bit of the same as with multidisciplinary teams. Why don't we do more of that in research? Well, we don't do more of that in research just because it's hard to pull off, because a lot of research is quite individual. Do you know what I mean? So it's like quite a lot of, you know, research. As I'm leading my research thing here and I'm going off and doing this, and I want to make some new algorithms or new qualitative findings. And it's only when you have things like, you know, the big grants where you've got a project which pulls together qual and quant people working together on the same problem. But most, you know, your PhD is typically an individual. That's how we set up research. We set it up as an individual activity. And it's important to learn how to do your research, but I think really the best results come when we work together with other people. But that requires a very specific and very deliberate setting up of a research team who's willing to work in that way and invested in it. And all your people need to be good. That's the thing, because you don't want to be carrying anyone. Everyone needs to be contributing.
Awesome. Thank you, Jacki. Again, if any of you have questions, please put them in the chat. Maybe we can start talking about the research questions that you've been looking at in the context of the future of work, and maybe how they connect to work that you've done before. Or do you want me to ask again?
So you're asking about the research questions around,
Yeah.
So our very first project that we did was looking at the impact of COVID on digital transformation in Africa. And we actually initially started with some quantitative data because basically I arrived in Kenya and in September 2020, and I was setting up my research team, but it's not like you want to wait till you have your whole team before you start doing your research. So I worked with a team that analyzes the data for Microsoft, and they looked at the Microsoft data for January 2020 and October 2020 for business accounts. And we found that there was a way bigger increase of business accounts in number of business accounts in Africa than elsewhere. And this was really interesting. I mean, it's partly due to market saturation in other places, but this was driven by small to medium businesses. So this was really interesting because they are not, and very small businesses were particular. So one seat account, which isn't necessarily a one person business, but it might be a 2 or 3 person business, maybe 10 max, were really, really big. So that, given that, and the fact that most business here on the continent is driven by SMBs and very small businesses, we thought we'd understand like what's the lived experience. So we did an interview study, had to be interviews because it was all not in person, obviously, because it was the pandemic, of small to medium businesses who were both customers and not customers of ours, and were both physical work businesses, so things like hair salons, bakeries, and then information work businesses as well, to understand how they've been impacted by COVID. And we found that it was so interesting. So we found that obviously they were forced into a digital transformation because of COVID. So suddenly there were lockdowns and they couldn't do their normal business. So they had to adopt technology. Some of them actually shut down, then adopted some technology, then opened again. Some managed to keep their business going. And for the information work businesses, the main technology they adopted was obviously meetings. So, you know, Zoom, Teams, Google Meet, whatever. And then for physical work businesses, social media marketing became a massive thing because they weren't able to interact with their customers in the same face-to-face way they had been before. So they started doing it typically over WhatsApp, but also Facebook and Instagram and things. But then what was interesting with that is as they transformed digitally, they could see the value of having digital technology. So although they started with this very reactive, oh my God, we got to do something, or we're not going to be able to carry on, this then started them on a digital transformation journey, where they're actually like, oh, what else can I do? What else can I do to change my business? This is really cool. Suddenly I'm getting data. Suddenly I'm getting like more access to customers. All sorts of things were going on. So they were then looking at how they could transform their business. And most of the information work businesses then went on this journey where they'd already done things. You know, for example, one group was introducing chatbots for their customer service. They'd introduced tablets. They were doing all sorts of really quite cool stuff. There was two companies, I think, they introduced augmented reality. So there's some really, really interesting things going on here. And that makes us think that there's a real opportunity, because they also had challenges. It's not like this solved everything, to think about how can we design technology that really supports the needs of SMBs.
Cool, thank you. And this SMB focus that you mentioned and the multimedia focus that you mentioned, that's something that again, familiar with from the Indian context. When you're looking at these like tech interactions, do you see, I guess, HCI research being relevant there? Like, research that you've seen in other spaces, perhaps?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So, you talked about, well, a lot of the businesses that you talked about, you said that they've been using multimedia systems and I guess various media technologies, right? And you've also done this research looking at multimedia and sharing practices in India, I know a few years ago. Are there differences in what you see? And we talked earlier about how the general kind of environment with the businesses is different, but do you also see unique types of interactions with these technologies, how they relate to people's kind of work practice?
Yeah, I would say it's hard to say really, because I've not looked at what happened with COVID and businesses. I think that many businesses in India were a little bit further forward in their digital transformation anyway, because of the cost of data. So data in India is exceptionally cheap. So I was working with, as you know, auto rickshaw drivers, tuk-tuk drivers in India around financial inclusion. And just in the course of the few years we were working with them, they went from pretty much zero smartphone penetration to the vast majority of them having smartphones and having data. And that wasn't the case here, because data is so much more expensive here. And so that's one of the things that makes a really big difference. And I think there's a lot of arguments that need to be made around simple policy, simple infrastructure policy. It's like, if you really want all your businesses to be digital, then you have to find a way to provide really cheap data. It's not and good access. It's not magic. The auto drivers adopted technology, even drivers who couldn't read and write. It's like that's something that I would say. And when actually I was here in Kenya just before COVID really went crazy, and someone actually said to me, "Oh, the challenge you're going to face is that many businesses are not really using like digital technology, not using much smart. I mean, they are using digital technology, but are not using much smartphones, not using much data. A lot of the mobile innovations are not relevant here." And of course, that changed with COVID, because people were, as I say, initially pushed into it, but then that actually adds an enormous. They see the benefit of it, I guess. So I can't compare, and especially not with qualitative research. I definitely can't compare, what we saw in India and what we saw here. I suspect as well the findings might be more generalizable to SMBs in many different places, but we obviously, without doing more studies, we can't make those links.
Thank you, Jacki. Andrew, you have your hand up.
Yes, this is really fascinating. Jacki, I'm curious. So you've been talking about the digital transformation, and that it's been an ongoing thing. And one thing that I find fascinating is how this COVID experience might be sort of a look into the future, maybe a window into what might be happening in some places, at least, 5 or 10 years down the line. So perhaps in the US context, it might be that working from home will be a lot more dominant than it ever was before. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that for Kenya, or maybe more broadly for Africa. I don't know if you can say that. So what are some of those things that you think might be here to stay and are sort of providing a window into what we could see in years to come?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure how much we know for anywhere. because I know a lot of talks about working from home and hybrid work, but I don't think we've yet really understood both the benefits and the difficulties of hybrid work, and that's whether you're in the US or whether you're in Kenya. I think it's going to take us some time to really see the benefits. Sorry, no, I have my other child. To see the benefit. I only have two though, so it's okay. To see the benefits and difficulties of hybrid work. So I think we're far from knowing what's really going to stay, but some things I think, like increased digital technology, increased smartphone use. I think some of this augmented reality stuff is really interesting. So one of the companies that started using the augmented reality was an engineering company that works across Africa, and suddenly they weren't able to go. They deal with big engineering plants and they fix things there, and they weren't able to go to different countries in Africa, and that's why they adopted this augmented reality solution. Obviously, that solution was only good for the really big companies they work with, because it's too expensive for the smaller companies. But what they were saying that was really interesting is they're saying, well, we have really senior engineers who've been doing this for a long time, and we don't want to lose them, but it's a difficult life because you're spending so long away from your family in normal times traveling. So one way to not lose them would be to enable them to stay at home and then talk to maybe more junior engineers who wanted to travel so I think it's, because travel came up again and again. Obviously it's the same in the US and same everywhere. That's one of the things that working from home really gives you a benefit of. So I think there's some things, there's a lot of talk about the metaverse, and I'm skeptical of some visions of it, but I also am seeing some real, especially around the augmented reality space, some real spaces where you can see that it has real benefits. Does that make sense? So I think we're not going to suddenly go undigital, and digitalization is going to increase. But then, it raises whole questions about sustainability. How do we create digital devices that we don't have to throw away every 2 years? Because that's not sustainable. So I think there's a whole, and then of course all the power used by data centers. So I think there's so many questions, because if you think about what's coming in the future, this massive change of work is really big, and understanding how that plays out, I don't think we will know until probably 7, 8, 9, 10 years. Then we've obviously got a climate crisis that's increasingly pressing, and so how does that going to interlink with people staying at home? Is that actually better environmentally, or is it not better? How is it going to play out with increasing use in devices? So I think there's some really complex questions that we'll just see. But I hope some of the research, the more technical research we're doing here, will play into that in a positive way. Thinking about, like, for example, how can you do video compression so that you can have video but without using too much bandwidth, without using too much battery power, without using too much. So I think there's some really hard technical problems as well as HCI problems. And I know I didn't really answer your question, I'm sorry, but the answer is obviously I don't know the answer to your question. But these are some of the things I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about how is work changing, and what, I think it's too easy for us just to say, oh, look, there's been this massive change. And I don't think it will go back to how it was, but I don't think we know what it's going to look like yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Thank you. So I'm curious with augmented reality. I'm just curious. Is that more HoloLens, or is that more sort of a cell phone? Or I'm curious what that was all about.
The video compression?
You were mentioning a tech company using augmented reality, right? For remote presence.
Yes. No, they made their own system using Epson glasses. They actually did want to do HoloLens, but we're not licensed in most African countries. So that's a bit of a that's a bit of a poor HoloLens. So that's like so they actually came up with their own system, which was kind of cool. And that's like a really cool example of the innovation that you see here as well.
Navina?
Thanks for chatting, Jackie. It's been really great to hear about this research and the new institute. And so I remember when the work we did, like work-life balance, or kind of like this bleeding between work and life, was a prominent concept that we were talking about. And obviously that's been a big thing during COVID as well, like with working from home. I was wondering if that kind of theme came up in the work.
Yeah, I think it wasn't as prominent a theme. Well, no, it sort of was actually. There's some interest. I was going to say it wasn't as prominent a theme as it was for the nurses. But I think that's partly because a lot of people were, working for their own businesses or working for very small businesses. And obviously work-life balance, you can see I don't have any. School is a great example of like the joys of all that. But in terms of, what was really interesting is the way that many companies and people within companies adapted to the pandemic. It was an absolute, so I've been talking about the positive sides around digital transformation, but it was an absolute nightmare for most of them. And all this transformation came because they had a sudden massive drop in income. So if you can imagine what that does, that even if you've got just a few people working for you. And one thing that was really interesting was the creative ways that companies managed that here. And I really liked the way it was done in some companies. So for example, there was one hotel where rather than getting rid of their staff worked 1 month and then had 1 month off, and the other staff worked 1 month and then had 1 month off. And so it's like you were on half a salary, so you got paid for the work you did, but rather than sacking everyone, they did that, so everyone got some salary. Does that make sense? And then there was also companies where they'd had someone who was full-time, for example, maybe a full-time accountant who they could no longer employ full-time. So they were like, okay, we're going to now pay you less, but you can work from home and you can go and do your own gigs. You know what I mean? So they're doing their own work. So there was these really interesting, like, things going around. So it's not so much about work-life balance, but about how you manage less money and less work. Does that make sense? In a way that is more equitable and is more concerned about the welfare of everybody, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? So, and then in terms of work-life balance, I mean, it's it's hard for many people to work from home. If you live in a small place and you have kids screaming and you have lots of people in the same room, that's really challenging to work from home. But then other people, were like, I think it's like anywhere with the pandemic, if you didn't have kids, it wasn't the worst thing in the world. If you're suddenly at home trying to do your jobs and homeschool your children, it's a bit of a nightmare. There were people who are like, well, I quite like it because, I can now just work when I need to work. We did see a massive difference in how organizations evaluated their workers, though. A load of organizations, the ones who did transformation to remote work most successfully, changed how they evaluated their workers, and it was not so much on the hours put in as the results achieved. So that was, and a couple of companies like went straight back as soon as they could, and that was because they were like, they couldn't get their mindset away from, if you're not like there and we can't see you working, you're not working. Does that make sense? So I think, again, Navina, I've answered a completely different question.
But still one in a really interesting direction. Yeah, that makes sense.